Hello again, 121. In this video today, I'm going to be going over the flowering of traditional China, chapter 10. And this is the period after the fall of the Han Dynasty. Remember, the Chinese traditionally feel that they are the people of the Han. And during this time after that dynasty declines, many of the nomadic tribes are successful in penetrating the wall. And many Chinese turned to messianic creeds that were promising earthly or heavenly salvation, and philosophical Taoism increased in popularity. The poet Lu Ling was the best known writer of this particular time, but neither the philosophical Taoism or the supernatural really satisfied the hope for a better life. What did work was Buddhism, as we've been talking about. It came there with traders, missionaries, and other merchants in the 1st or 2nd century Common Era. And the Mahayana school is the more popular branch of Buddhism. And those missionaries were some of the advocates and missionaries who helped to spread this into Chinese culture. Here are some of the other dynasties that come along now after the Han, the Su, Tang, and Sung dynasties. The country is reunified again in 581. Su Wen-ti, he founded monasteries for both Taoist and Buddhist philosophers, and many Buddhist monks were appointed to key positions. A new canal was constructed, and his son, Sui Yangdi, continued this process, and the Grand Canal, it's 1,400 miles long, which linked the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, is completed during this dynasty. It ends with the death of Su Yangdi, and he was a tyrannical ruler over time who lost popularity because of a failed military campaign against the Koreans, and he ended up getting murdered in his palace upon return. Li Yuan founded then the Tang dynasty, and he is killed by his son Tang Tangzong. And those are the years of the Tang dynasty. And he expands China further into Xinjiang is a new region in the northwest. Tibet during this time comes under the control of the Chinese. Southern provinces like Vietnam were assimilated into the empire again, and there are other relations with Southeast Asia. They continue to demand tribute from other regions. Korea accepted at this time, and Japan will send officials to learn different customs and institutions, such as helping to solidify their writing systems. Many believe the Tang dynasty represents the finest era in creativity in those areas, and there's still Buddhist influence in literature, philosophy, politics, and religion. Chang'an became possibly the greatest city in the world at that time, with an estimated population of nearly 2 million. But the traditional court intrigue and corruption eventually comes in. That particular ruler was dominated by his concubine, and the concubine's protege will seize power in 755. In the outer regions of the dynasty, generals are really in control. This collapse is similar to the collapse of the Han dynasty. Nomadic peoples will again start to penetrate and take over certain areas. The Uyghurs and the Kyrgyz will eventually turn on the Tang and overthrow it. After 50 years of chaos, the Sung dynasty comes to power, and this one lasts quite a while. They lose control of Tibet during this time. There are some factors of prosperity and economic expansion, but eventually the failure to control the north will lead to their collapse. They will be forced in later years to pay tribute to the Jurchen peoples of Manchuria, and because of this, they're seeking alliances to curb the power of Manchuria, and as a result they struck an alliance with an obscure nomadic people from the Gobi Desert called the Mongols. And the Mongols will help them out. They will defeat the Jurchen, but now they will turn their attention to overthrowing the Sung. They do, and with this defeat by the Mongols, the Yuan or Mongol dynasty is established in China. Confucianism is solidified. The Song will be successful in curbing the aristocratic control of the civil service, and it is the primary route to an official career in China. And during this time, the examination system pretty much attains the form it's going to have into the 20th century for those different magistrate levels. The local level exam is given annually, and the other two are every 3 years. Questions on Buddhist and Taoist texts as well were added in during the time. During the Song dynasty, it's strictly on Confucian classics. You got to memorize all kinds of details, define moral lessons. And this guarantees that Confucian principles are indoctrinated, but not whether the ethics of Confucius are actually followed by these officials. It's open to all males except criminals. There are academies at the provincial and district levels. And this helped to get a broader population base into the civil service. Non-aristocratic gentry. But the scholar gentry is the ones who will dominate. Usually, periodically they're out of power, but they always end up coming back in. This is not equal opportunity. This is only for males. Only those with a basic education at home had a chance. If some wealthy relative was willing to sponsor them, then they have more time to study. This doesn't guarantee an honest, efficient bureaucracy. The court intrigues are still going on, and all of these other problems. You must help out your relatives, and Confucian ethics actually approves of this with the idea of filial piety. And merit-based bureaucracies are not going to exist even in the Western world until the 1800s. This was the way of the world, taking care of those close to you. Bribery was very important to get things done. Land reform is a perennial economic revival. Why? To attempt to reduce aristocratic power, the equal field system. As long as you kept paying your taxes and performed some labor, you will hang on to your lands. And because there's now more of an incentive to control your land, there's more agricultural prosperity. People are working harder for a time. Eventually, the aristocrats learned how to manipulate the system. Because there is limited cultivable land, limited land that can be put into agricultural production. Eventually, there is more private landowning, and when this happens, eventually land will tend to come into the hands of a few. The Song dynasty attempts to return to the early Tang policies. More important was there was new lands that opened in the Yangtze with the opening of the Grand Canal. And improvements in irrigation techniques allowed for more land to be cultivated. And at this time, the Southeast Asians, mainly the Vietnamese, introduced a new type of crop, a new type of rice that permitted at least 2 crops, sometimes more, in warmer climates. Trade and manufacturing increases, and here are some of the technological developments of these particular dynasties. Gunpowder is invented by the Tang. Paper was the Han, don't make that mistake. Textiles are now going to be put into manufacturing, mainly cotton. Flying money or credit is introduced by the Song. That's interesting. They invented credit. Because it's dangerous to carry a lot of money around out in the frontier. So they developed banking systems using strings of copper coins. The Silk Road is at its zenith in these years. We're talking about from the 500s through the beginning of the 1300s. The compass is invented at this time. All of these things are exported, and they will import those particular items. Canton is a major port of exit. Again, the traditional older brother, younger brother technique is used. China views themselves as the older brother. Unlike the Europeans, cities didn't possess special privileges, again, because the merchant class has very small, bad status. The vast majority of the Chinese are still living off land in villages of a few dozen up to several thousand. The son would marry and bring his wife back to the parents' home, where an addition would be added if possible. Within the family unit, the eldest male will theoretically be the boss and retains legal rights over his wife. If she does not provide him with a male heir, he was permitted to take a second wife. The traditional male superiority continues. Poor families would often sell their daughters to wealthy villagers. Foot binding is carried out. And this continues into the 20th century. It represented submissiveness and self-discipline, two required attributes of the ideal Confucian wife. And could you imagine working in the fields with feet like that? The Empress Wu was the exception to the male domination. Again, the concubine of Tang ruled through her sons until 690, when she comes right out and says that I am the Empress. Cited that Buddhist sutra that said a woman would rule the world 700 years after the death of Siddhartha. She was a capable ruler who gave real meaning to the civil service exam and promoted graduates to the highest positions in government. The Mongol Empire. The Mongols will adopt the Chinese political system. They will revive the civil service after a time of its decline. And this dynasty got a lot of support from the majority of the Chinese, because people of the north were used to foreign rule periodically. And the people of the south respected the stability that the Mongols brought to China after a period of warfare. This was a time of economic prosperity. They built a paved highway adjacent to the Grand Canal into Khan Balik, which we know today as Beijing. What can we say about the Mongols? They were superior soldiers. They didn't like sedentary life. They were nomads, and they preferred living like that. Because in this era is usually viewed as a tragic period, and they probably spread the Black Death carried by lice in their saddlebags. Most historians don't dispute their brutality, but there is a Pax Mongolica that followed the different empires that were set up, and a basic information circuit that spread commodities, ideas, and inventions from one end of the Eurasian supercontinent to the other. Eventually, the Mongols were defeated by forces under Zhu Yanzhang. He was a peasant. He was starving in that famine, became the leader of bandits, and a number of rivals declared the foundation of the Ming Dynasty, or Bright Dynasty. This is another very, very prosperous Chinese dynasty. Yang Li strengthened the Great Wall. And at this time, manufacturing and trading with other areas of the earth will take place. During the Ming, the population doubles again because new crops were introduced. And Cheng Hua will actually explore much of the known world. Why did they undertake these voyages? The Emperor Yongle is seeking to ascertain if his predecessor was still alive. They know for sure that they traveled to these different areas, into Southwest Asia, South Asia, and the East African coast. That is definite. Some historians speculate that he went all the way around the world, way, way before Columbus's time exploring the Western Hemisphere. It's not known for sure because the Chinese turned inward after this. Probably because the civil service, the aristocrats were becoming jealous of all the wealth being generated by this world trade. Families were moved from the fertile Yangtze to the north to counter pressure from the north. And this took away power from South China. And when they saw, if he did travel to the Western Hemisphere, there wasn't anything out there to see. We are superior to these people. Therefore, there's no reason to travel to these regions anymore. We are the Middle Kingdom. But not too many scholars really believe that he circumnavigated the globe. Buddhism becomes more Chinese in character. Tantrism, the White Lotus group. These are some other types of Buddhism. There's a lot of xenophobia, fear of outsiders. The Buddhists become wealthy. And also filial piety and hard work are not emphasized by these Buddhists. And it undermines the traditional family which is needed for rice cultivation. The school of the mind will attempt to counter the ideas of the Buddhists. Juji, Neo-Confucianism, attempts to unite Buddhist and Taoist doctrines into Confucianism, and they talk about the material and the transcendent or Taiji world. However, Wang Yangming disagrees with Zhu Ji's focus on the investigation of the outside world. He says the correct way to transcend the material world is through the school of the mind. Knowledge is intuitive, not empirical. And this is going to be the big influence on China into the 20th century. Self-reflection, not empiricism. And eventually China is going to fall behind because their scientific knowledge is going to fall behind as we get into the 15 and 1600s. Even though they excelled in all these practical knowledge areas, all these great inventions that they made. But mathematics, they will fall behind. There's no geometry, there's no astronomy, physics, or optics. And the scholar gentry will embrace Neo-Confucianism and the school of the mind, and this will be the big educational school, again, into the 20th century. Whereas in the West, an urban middle class develops out of the merchant class, and eventually they are going to want to promote their social prestige, their political power, and their intellectual ideas. These are some of the literature achievements. Li Bo, Du Fu. Confucian moralisms are emphasized. Porcelain was greatly prized, and their style, or the translucency of Chinese porcelain, doesn't reach Europe until the 1700s. And that's about it for chapter 10.